What up, fellow nerds? It's me, David. For a change of pace, I'm in my living room. I've got some blue and red lighting. Yeah, pretty thematic because I am going to go where no man has boldly gone before. Into the depths of the Star Wars prequels and its political system. Yes, that's right, I'm discussing the Star Wars prequels. The one thing the world was missing out on. A lengthy essay about the Star Wars. Wow! Yeah, that's right, I'm finally doing it. Hold your praise until the end of the episode. It's fine. Not all heroes wear capes. Some of them wear fairy bread t-shirts. For those not familiar with Auspol Explained and me, I usually am discussing, the Australian Parliament and monarchy, but instead I'm going to be talking about the Galactic Senate and the monarchy of Naboo. Spoilers, the political system Star Wars is bad. Like, truly garbage. It's like George Lucas grabbed a bunch of political words, put them in a blender, and then just pasted the tattered carcass of what's left of his dictionary into a script and hoped that we wouldn't notice because there was enough lightsaber battles, explosions, and really cringy bad romance. I warn you, I noticed. George, I noticed it. You should have consulted me, George. Even though The Phantom Menace came out when I was 7, we all know that Star Wars is at its core political. Like, the Rebel Alliance takes on the authoritarian Empire, whose soldiers are called stormtroopers. That's not subtle. That's like super political. That's as political as it gets. But while, the Galactic Senate in the original trilogy is just, this sort of background thing that gets mentioned in one meeting before Darth Vader force chokes someone, it's not really important to the plot. You don't need to know anything about how the system works. You just need to know there is a good guy, there is a bad guy, they live in the galaxy, pew 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 pew, It's set dressing. It's so in the background it's nearly invisible behind the flurry of lightsabers, spaceships, and unconventional brother-sister relationships. Hey George, I have so many questions. But in the prequels, it's unavoidable. The prequels are basically about 3 things. Palpatine seducing the Galactic Senate to give him more and more power until he can become the Emperor, Anakin being seduced by the dark side of the Force until he can become Darth Vader, and me being seduced by Ewan McGregor. No further comment. So I'm basically going to do 2 things. I'm going to dive into the political world of the Star Wars prequels to explain how the system works, and then also critique how the system doesn't work and is a bunch of garbage nonsense soup. Even though my whole thing is discussing politics, I feel like this one's going to have a more controversial comment section than any of my previous episodes. So let's strap in. There's going to be spoilers for the first 3 episodes, obviously, but I'm not going to do a full recap of the plot. I'm just going to be referencing the specific beats and parts here to give context to the politics that I'm talking about. So if you haven't seen the prequels by now, 1, good for you. 2, this is going to be an interesting but confusing experience for you with the limited context that you have, and let me know how that goes. Comment down below. I have watched these movies a lot of times. They're part of my childhood. I do enjoy them. But I also need to tell you that I want to tear them apart. I think this is something that we can all agree with. So, let's take this with good faith. I don't hate Star Wars. I love it. I also love critiquing fictional politics. So, how does the Galactic Senate work? How? Well, the Galactic Senate has a vague pseudo-parliamentary structure to it, but it also very clearly borrows things from the US system of Congress that George Lucas is more familiar with. He's tried to combine elements of other systems as well to make it feel otherworldly and not just a carbon copy of the US Congress, which as a result leads to it being utter garbage. I'm not just being mean here, it genuinely doesn't make sense, and there are so many holes in this. Are you ready for all the holes? Finally, someone's out there saying it. Star Wars prequels were bad. I'm the only one brave enough to do this. Now, one strength of the Galactic Senate in terms of the plot is that it is the unicameral legislature of the Republic. What this basically means is that, that room with the floating circular platforms, that's the Senate, that's it. There are no other chambers for laws to be debated on and voted on. If it passes there, it's now a law. This is in contrast to like legislatures in the US and Australia, where they have two chambers, a bicameral system. In those countries, it's called the House of Representatives and the Senate. In other countries, they have different names. So for the purposes of the rise of the empire, a unicameral system simplifies it because Palpatine only really needs to control one chamber, while in most bicameral systems, you don't really get ultimate control over both at any given time, except for in massive election wins. The Senate is comprised of senators and also representatives, which is confusing, but I'll explain it later. It apparently has 24,372 different systems represented, and each one gets 2 senators each, which is truly untenable and is just physically impossible to put into a single room, which kind of reminds me how the Parliament of the UK has more members than it physically has seats. The House of Commons has about 650 people in it, but there are only 427 seats, whereas the House of Lords has like 800, but only 400 physical seats. Why did they design it like that? They had an opportunity to make it bigger. They didn't. Wah! I mean, obviously, if you're going to represent most of a galaxy, it's pretty much impossible to have everyone fit into a single room. So that's not really a critique of Star Wars so much as me dragging the UK Parliament, just so you know that fun fact. I suppose like the best real-world analog I can think of is the European Union, which has the European Parliament and European Council, which passes laws to do with things like treaties, trade, etc. While those laws affect the European Union broadly, the people that are in that parliament are elected from their own sort of nations within the European Union who have their own domestic governments, and they only make laws for just their specific nations. So there is this mixture of legislatures for the area. So the laws would vary planet to planet. So like Naboo's laws and legislature is different to Coruscant's, but they both, as part of the Republic, have a blanket ban on slavery. Halfway through episode 1, Queen Padme Amidala learns to challenge her effectively space Eurocentrism when she lands on Tatooine and discovers that the reach of the Republic does not reach the Outer Rim, and therefore Anakin is a little slave boy. Just like the laws of France can't touch me here in Australia. Just try and get me, President Macron. You can't touch me. I'm safe from you. Out of the giant pool of galactic senators, one of them is chosen to be the Supreme Chancellor, sometimes just referred to as the Chancellor. Palpatine wants to become Supreme Chancellor because that means he'll get to be the head of the executive branch of government, which enables him to have more power than just a regular senator. Not unlimited, but it is an upgrade. To understand this, I'll break down the 3 branches of government. That's right, suckers, you're actually going to learn things about Parliament. There is the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. The legislature makes the laws. That's the Senate. The judiciary is the court system. The judges then interpret and apply those laws. The executive does many things like signing bills into law, managing government departments, and appointing ministers in the cabinet, as well as judges. Depending on which country you're in, the executive either has like a lot of like personal power, like the US president, or serves a more mechanical ceremonial role to just give authority to the legislature, like in Australia. Basically, Palpatine is just trying to become mega space president, the most powerful big boy there is in the galaxy. Being Supreme Chancellor also gives him the chance to veto bills passed by the Senate. Like all things, veto powers would vary from country to country, but for the US, for example, the president can refuse a bill and send it back to Congress. But Congress, if they vote with a 2/3 majority of both chambers, can override that veto. That's pretty difficult to achieve, so there have only really been 7% of vetoes overridden in US congressional history. In Australia, it's technically possible for the Governor-General and governors to refuse to sign a bill, but that just doesn't happen. That's just not a thing that by convention is used. Now, this power seems really good, right? That's the kind of thing that would help Palpatine become more powerful, yeah? No. I mean, it would if it was a presidential system, but it's not. The Chancellor can be removed via a motion of no confidence. That's a vote in the chamber to simply remove the person from that position. It's something that applies to prime ministers in a parliamentary system. You know, if you've lost the confidence of the chamber, you should resign. So Palpatine can use his veto powers to prevent legislation that he doesn't like from passing, but then also the Senate could then just vote him out of the position, thus incentivizing him to not ever use his veto powers that he just gained. Now, if you were designing from scratch a real-world legislature, this actually seems like a reasonable check and balance to ensure that this executive power is not abused and misused. However, from a plot point perspective, this entirely undermines Palpatine's stronghold on power over the Senate. Hey, George, you know how you could have fixed this? You could have just made the Chancellor a popularly elected figure, like a president, and then have Chancellor Valorum removed via impeachment. That way, it's not too much like the US presidential system, because no president has ever been removed via impeachment, ever. Therefore, it's still a fantasy fiction. It still works, George. It's also up to the executive to appoint judges. So when there is a vacancy in the Supreme Court of the Republic, it is then up to Palpatine to officially sign off on who gets to be the next High Court Justice. This is pretty important to Palpatine because the courts are the ones that make decisions on whether or not, like, a bill has legal force. Is it constitutional? Is the government allowed to do this? Has the government overstepped its constitutional or legislative power? So it's possible for someone to challenge Palpatine through the court system, but if he's stacked the bench with so many judges that are under his thrall, they can make rulings in his favor and continue his abuse of power. Now, I don't want you to think poorly of the court system in real life. They are actually usually more independent, but in the Star Wars universe, we know for a fact they are corrupt and they don't work. Now, an important note here is that you don't just hire and fire judges. It's not a McDonald's, right? If they get the order wrong, you can't just replace them. Now, in Australia, judges automatically retire at age 70. This is predictable, stable, and refreshes the courts periodically. Meanwhile, in the US, they just wait until they retire or die. Courts are not well known for their high turnover rate, so, the only real practical way that we can infer that Palpatine has managed to get enough people on his side and create enough vacancies is for him to very convincingly, wink, tell them to retire to create a vacancy, or killed them. Because he's evil. Maybe for the sake of time, George was like, whatever, look, he can just murder several judges off screen. Maybe that's in an extended universe comic book or novel, I don't know. There should be a deleted scene where Mace Windu and Yoda are walking and talking to each other, being it's so weird that the dark side of the Force is blinding us to what's happening around us, while we, the audience, can very clearly visibly see in the background Palpatine just physically choking to death a Supreme Court justice. Those pesky Sith, they're so mysterious. How do they get away with it? They ask as they step over the still warm, dead body of Supreme Court Justice Varvax from the blah-de-blah system. The position of Chancellor also comes with the position of being the Commander-in-Chief. The Commander-in-Chief is a position that has, to some extent, control over the military. The problem here for Palpatine is the Republic doesn't have one. So, enter stage left, the Trade Federation. Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, opens with the mega corporation, the Trade Federation, engaging in an illegal blockade on the peaceful planet of Naboo. This is over a dispute to do with taxation on their trade routes, which is exactly what you would expect Amazon to do if they had both a standing army and an obligation to pay tax. To resolve this issue, Chancellor Valorum sends in secret 2 Jedi Knights, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn. If you've ever wondered what Jedi Knights do, they're basically the interplanetary law enforcement of the Republic. Basically, they're space cops. Instead of a standing army, the Senate sends Jedis as peacekeepers to, ideally, peacefully mediate disputes between planets. these negotiations sometimes turn violent, as Anakin talks about in episode 2. Is Chancellor Valorum relying on this violence? You know how it is, you secretly send in your paramilitary wizard squad over trade disputes without any congressional approval or oversight, and maybe it leads to an assassination of a corporate CEO who also has Senate representation. Maybe it doesn't. Who knows? Accountability? Ain't that the thing with numbers? Unfortunately, Newt Gunray, Viceroy of the Trade Federation and corporate overlord, escapes unscathed with his life. The blockade then continues, which leads to Queen Padme Amidala getting onto Coruscant with a little bit of a side quest and giving an address to the Galactic Senate about, hey, my planet's being invaded. Just as Palpatine has primed her to expect, the Senate delays action, which causes Padme, out of frustration, to move a motion of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum, which is utter garbage. Padme is not part of the Galactic Senate. In episode 2, she's a senator, but in episode 1, she's part of an entirely different legislature as the Queen of Naboo. Remember the European Union? That's separate. She can't do that. To illustrate this, imagine if you were taking a tour of Parliament or Congress and you noticed that it was in session, so you decided to just walk in the door and start introducing your own laws. That doesn't make sense. And before you tell me, no, she just called for one and a different senator then introduced it, no, canonically, she is the one who introduces it, it is second, and then it is voted on. She did that. She was the one who moved that motion. That doesn't make sense. But on top of that, that's not even Padme. That is her handmaiding masquerading as her for the sake of security purposes so she doesn't get assassinated or taken by the Trade Federation. So not only do we have someone who is not actually a member of this elected body, but also the person who's doing that motion is a 14-year-old committing identity fraud, and that is the beginnings of the rise of the fascist empire. What kind of nonsense system is this, George? No, really, that's the beginning of the rise of the Empire. Palpatine basically tricked the Trade Federation to invade his home planet so that he can use this to take down Chancellor Valorum and use the sympathy vote to elect himself as the new Chancellor. This, by the way, would be the perfect time for Chancellor Valorum to point out how he actually did send the Jedi Knights to investigate and already can vouch for Padme / her imposter. Like, hey guys, I sent the space cops. They witnessed the space crime. And instead of just letting any random person walk in and just say whatever they want, you might as well just ask the Jedi Knights that you sent to deal with this very issue to back up Padme. Valorum is on Padme's side. He could have brought that up and survived this vote, but no, instead he's taken down by a literal child who does not have a seat in the Senate. You know who does have a seat? The Trade Federation. The Trade Federation's existence in the Senate means that the Republic is already a dystopia long before the rise of the Empire. The Trade Federation is not a planet. It's not a system of planets. It is a corporation that just got so large that they're given 2 senators. This is like if Space Amazon just automatically got to elect senators off its own board. There's no need for lobbying or trying to meet with senators to come up with, deals for sizable donations for their campaign, for, maybe introducing less regulation, wink wink. No, Space Amazon just straight up directly gets to introduce bills on its own deregulation of its own industry, as well as then sit on committees that examine its own corporate governance, and then also have a vote in who gets to be the head of the executive that manages the entire system. Can you imagine how hellish that would be? That's the worst imaginable political system out there. Just bad. I know I try to be politically neutral here, but I'm going to boldly say I don't think corporations should vote. I think people, individual people, should be the ones who actually have the say in the democratic process. The Trade Federation isn't the only corporation on the Senate, by the way. The Techno Union also has a seat. This has horrifying implications that, if your stock price gets large enough, you just get an automatic seat in the legislature. Space capitalism to the extreme. The only vague real world parallel I can think of is the Dutch East India Company. It got so large in the 1600s and 1700s that it managed to be able to make its own treaties, colonize territory, mint coins. But it was eventually reined in by the Dutch government. But imagine if it didn't. And also it was in space, and now it's part of the legislature. And don't think that I just have gripes with the Galactic Senate, because Naboo's system of government makes no sense whatsoever. Padme is 14 when she is elected to be Queen of Naboo. Now, children can be on thrones. King Louis XIV of France, for example, was a literal 4-year-old child when he first became king. But that's because his dad died, and most monarchies are hereditary and also automatic. A child on the throne is not really a bug in the system so much as it is one of those features that you unlock by accident by playing around with swords too much or not having your poison tester taste your wine ahead of time. Padme, however, is elected. The public want her to be queen. But also there are term limits. This poses many bizarre and concerning questions. One, a monarchy is a system of government where a person serves until they either abdicate or die. They are the head of state until either of those two options happen. Monarchies are usually hereditary, although elected ones do exist. The monarchy of Cambodia, for example, is elected, but it's done by the Royal Council of the Throne, which is made up of only 9 people, and the candidates are still royal descendants. So it's not really an open election just for anyone. The Pope is also kind of like an elected monarchy, because they're the head of state of the Vatican, which is a sovereign state. But remember, even the rare elected monarchies that exist still serve for life or abdication. The monarchy of Naboo does not do that because there are 2 2-year term limits, which means that it doesn't fit the criteria and it's not a monarchy. It's a republic. That's not what that word means, George. It's not a monarchy, it's a republic. A republic has an elected head of state, which can serve for a limited time or have the option of being re-elected, potentially indefinitely, but has to be re-elected. But that's not the worst part of it, because Padme is not the youngest queen that Naboo has elected. The youngest, by the way, was 12. This planet elects literal children to be the highest point in their entire system of government. So, what is the voting age on Naboo? Because you can't run for office unless you are eligible to vote, so we know that it's at least 12? Is there a limit at all? Can 10-year-olds vote for who is queen? Do literal 5-year-olds fill out their ballot in crayon? According to Wikipedia, candidates also run anonymously, which is also baffling. I want to vote for the mystery queen. I hope she's 15 at least, I guess. No wonder Naboo doesn't have a standing army. Children would just dissolve it and then demand everyone just be nice to each other. And also ban homework. It's banned now. I don't like it. But don't worry, if you don't like the decisions of the elected monarch, you just have to wait literally only 2 years. What a fast turnaround. So, hey, if you think they made some bad decisions, just vote for the 16-year-old next time, I guess. They're way more mature. By the time Padme has finished her 2 terms, she's actually 18. And comments in episode 2 that people of Naboo even wanted to amend the constitution to allow her to serve beyond her term limits. Hey, extending constitutional term limits seems a bit dodgy. I sure hope this concept doesn't get revisited at some point soon later on. It seems like the people of Naboo actually learned what it was like to have an adult in charge and were like, oh wait, can we keep that? Nah. But alas, Padme just decides to ditch that and become a senator. Also, side note, why is Naboo so racially segregated? The humans and Gungans live in entirely separate hemispheres, and the Gungans speak of how the humans think that they're superior. Padme, the queen of the entire planet, has only ever herd of Gungans, and the first one she ever meets is Jar Jar Binks on their way to Tatooine. Gungans are indigenous. Humans are not. The humans of Naboo get Senate representation, while the Gungans, we don't actually see them have any elected senators. So like, hey George, are the people of Naboo secretly the descendants of genocidal colonizers? Or are the Gungans just like reclusive overthinkers who think like, well, we weren't invited to this party, I guess everyone in Naboo hates us and we're gonna cut off all contact now? Like, are they the victims of apartheid? Or are they just so introverted and socially anxious as to not be able to interact with other people unless they have constant validation? Both of those are nightmare scenarios. But hey, episode 1 ends with, thankfully, the Gungans offering up their soldiers to help liberate Naboo from the droid army. So, whatever horrifying sins Padme's ancestors may have committed, they're irrelevant, they're forgiven, forgotten, we can move on forever. It's fine. And now we get to episode 2. Palpatine's plan continues to grow like an evil balloon or something. The invasion of Naboo has been thwarted, but Palpatine still needs there to be some sort of crisis to convince the Senate to create a military, so the Trade Federation continues to be a little bee in everyone's bonnet. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Newt Gunray's gonna sting you all. I don't know. You don't know what he's got under those robes. Maybe it is a bee sting. After 4 trials in the Supreme Court, he's still the viceroy, which is wild. Like, what's causing all these retrials? Like, are there new charges? Is there new evidence? Like, what is going on? How many Supreme Court justices is Palpatine continuously murdering in the background to make sure that the courts are stacked in a way that favors the results he wants here? These are the questions that I wish I knew the answer to, but they'll never be answered. Never mind, moving on. To ensure that this crisis continues to grow and bubble up to a point where Palpatine can use it for personal leverage to gain power, the Trade Federation, which again is not a planet, is trying to instill separatist sentiment across the galaxy and encourage systems to secede from the Republic, to become independent. Fearing that the peace of the Republic will be damaged, they consider creating an army, which is of course the best way to ensure peace. Episode 2 opens with Padme returning to Coruscant. She's a senator now, which means that she's gone from a monarchy to a republic, which would be an interesting transition and actually mean something if George had used those words appropriately, but he didn't, so oh well. Padme's ship explodes, shock horror, on the landing pad, and someone has tried to assassinate her. But why? We learn that this is because she's there as the leader of the opposition to continue her campaign and try and vote down the Military Creation Act. So let's break that down, and why that doesn't make much sense. The opposition is usually the group that has the second most seats, so by its very nature cannot outvote the government. The only way that Padme can get her way is if, there is an absence in the votes or defectors, or there is a minority government where Palpatine has less than half the votes and therefore must convince either part of the opposition or unaligned minor parties and independents on the crossbench to vote with him. But we know that Palpatine controls the Senate. That's super clear. That's the main problem. So by its very nature, the leader of the opposition, Padme, does not have enough votes to vote down the Military Creation Act. Not that you would do that, because you don't vote on acts. You vote on bills. An act is what a bill becomes after it has been passed. Say it with me, everyone, now. That's not what that word means, George. After a second assassination attempt involving space centipedes, Padme is told, hey, she really needs to leave Coruscant for her own personal safety. And she is also assigned Anakin, our moody Jedi Knight in training, to be her personal bodyguard. Where are you going to go as the senator from Naboo to make sure people don't kill you? Naboo, of course. To avoid detection, they're told to travel as refugees. The idea that traveling as a refugee is somehow an efficient way to get somewhere and also doesn't result in massive amounts of government scrutiny and examination of who you are to make sure that you're not lying about your purpose, travel mode, and identity. That's a massive work of fiction. That's the most fictional part of this entire film, with laser swords in space. Star Wars, to be fair, would be a lot less interesting if Padme ended up being in like limbo for 9 years in an off-planet detention center, waiting to be processed and eventually relocated to a literal third world solution, only for her to one day get out and discover, oops, wow, there's a galactic empire that's risen around me while I was busy being like a fake refugee. So before she goes, she appoints Jar Jar Binks to be her representative, which is not a senator. Basically, this means that before then, he did not have real input or power. He didn't have voting rights in the Senate, or supposedly he did, because anyone can just walk in. We've seen this from Star Wars Episode 1. But in her absence, he's now been appointed basically as a deputy to step up and fulfill the actual legislative role that an actual senator would have, and do what Padme can do on her behalf while she is not present. Systems get 2 senators each, which means that the Chancellor, much like the Prime Minister, is an elected member of the legislature. This means that Palpatine, the warmongerer, needs to get elected domestically in Naboo first to be sent to the Galactic Senate, just like Padme, the pacifist, also needs to get elected in Naboo before she can go to the Galactic Senate. This means that his entire plan doesn't just rely on him manipulating the Galactic Senate, but also for him to continue his political career by multiple re-elections in Naboo. So this entire plan could have just been derailed if there was a grassroots movement to unseat him and therefore take him away from the Senate. Just saying. But for real though, you should enroll to vote and update your details if you haven't already. Your vote actually matters. So anyway, now that Jar Jar Binks actually has like the power to do anything in the Senate, he happens to be in the room with the Vice Chancellor and Palpatine. You know, the Vice Chair is the weird blue guy with like tentacles on his head. Jar Jar just overhears them talking about, like, hey, Palpatine should have emergency powers to resolve the growing crisis. But, who would be so bold to do such a thing? If only Padme was here. And then there's just this weird awkward pause where they just like stare into nothing. Weird editing there, George. Jar Jar instantly forgets that Padme would find this utterly repugnant and has literally been forced off-world because she opposes this specific kind of thing. So then anyway, he just moves to grant the Chancellor emergency powers, thus allowing Palpatine to grow in his quest to become the Emperor. That suggests that like Jar Jar was the deciding vote here, by the way. Like if Padme's presence was such a big issue that like she nearly had to be killed repeatedly just to force her off-world, does that mean like the votes were actually tied? Was Jar Jar Binks the one who allowed Palpatine to rise to power simply by tipping the votes by a single person? What? Palpatine's plan relies on things going just right, including Obi-Wan Kenobi not dying several times over. Kenobi's role in like the rise of the Empire is like bizarre, and it's not to do with his dynamic with Anakin at all. After like nearly dying after chasing an assassin that tried to kill Padme, he learns about Kamino from like a space Machamp that owns a diner on Coruscant. It's a planet that's so secretive that it's not even noticed that it's been erased from the Jedi archives, but it's famous enough that they're well known for their most popular export, which is clones. That's like the main industry of the planet. Who's buying them if no one knows that it's there? I don't know, why hasn't Kamino noticed that no one comes to visit anymore? Anyway, so Obi-Wan Kenobi goes to investigate and is greeted by the Prime Minister of Kamino. The Prime Minister, the head of government of an entire planet, is just casually meeting with a guy who has gone through no security screening, doesn't know what's going on, and is asking random suspicious questions about a highly lucrative and important military contract. And the Prime Minister is not only readily available, but also like super chill about this. You couldn't have had like the Minister for Defense, George? The CEO of Clone Corps? You know, like, governments can create their own corporation. Like, Australia Post is a government business, right? But it has its own CEO and board and managers that you can talk to. You don't have an issue with your mail not being delivered and go to the Prime Minister of the country to be like, hey, where are my stamps? That's not how it works, George. George Lucas really needed to just throw in more political words just to remind us that, like, he knows of these words. He's not super sure what, like, they mean, but, like, he knows of them and he wants you to know that. Also, who is paying for all of these clones? Where's the money coming from? There's no appropriation bill that came out of the Senate. The plot holes are just so big that Obi-Wan Kenobi just walks through them without noticing them. Then, after narrowly being killed by Jango Fett more than once, he then stumbles upon a plot by, the Trade Federation and Count Dooku and the Banking Clan and the Techno Union to create an armed militia. These are mega corporations and banks so big that they are creating their own standing army through a secretive board meeting to raise enough investment capital to fuel the droid army factories so they can then use that to destabilize a democratic republic, which then leads to the rise of a fascist empire. And yet somehow having the protagonist of the sequel trilogies be a woman was too political for certain parts of the internet. Because media literacy is dead now, I guess. This is really important though to the plot because Kenobi reports back to Coruscant that A, the clone army exists, and B, the droid army exists, which then leads to Yoda going to Kamino to assume control of the clone army and then using that to initiate the Clone Wars. The timeline of all these events, by the way, it's not great. So Jar Jar Binks votes to give Palpatine emergency powers before the Clone Wars begin. Those emergency powers include not needing to step down for re-election until a time of Palpatine's choosing, and also enact martial law in local areas, even though at that point in time when the Emergency Powers Act was created, they didn't have a military yet. Also, I looked this up, and the Senate had already amended the Constitution years prior to the start of Episode 2 to allow Palpatine to serve for a third term, because just like the US presidential system, the Chancellor has 2 terms with a 4-year limit. So, like, just the threat of planets seceding before they've even engaged in violence is such a big concern to the Republic that they've given Palpatine emergency powers and extended his time in office. You couldn't have, like, just tweaked the timing of that better, George? Because, like, you could have just made them 2 terms of 5 years. Because, it would look as if Palpatine's about to retire, but just as he's reached the end of his term, there's war! Oh no, it's too volatile now for an exchange of power. The Senate must rush to create emergency powers. Yes, that's literally such a simple problem to fix. George, you made a problem to break your own movie. It's all made up. So we get to Episode 3, War. What is it good for? Expanding executive power in vague and non-specific ways in the background. So Episode 3 begins with Palpatine being rescued from an attempted kidnapping by the Separatists, which results in Anakin killing Count Dooku, who had been a leading force in the Separatist army. This leaves General Grievous, the weird sort of cyborg character, who is now the main military commander of the droid army. The Senate is expected to vote to continue the war so long as General Grievous is alive to start stuff and find out, which is kind of like the US system of government where you require the approval of Congress to declare war. It's not just up to the president. So ever since World War II, they just don't declare war, by the way, which really challenges a lot of people's idea of like what actually the US military has been up to for the past like 80 years, give or take, but like, don't blame me, I'm not the person who wrote the system and I'm not involved in it. The Australian system is similar to like the British system of convention where historically it's been the sole royal prerogative of the king or queen to declare a war on another nation. However, in a constitutional monarchy, the royal powers are effectively exercised on the advice of elected ministers. So In reality, it's the Australian Prime Minister who can send us into war without actually needing the approval of Parliament at all. As the Galactic Senate is a pseudo-parliamentary system, it would have still made sense if Palpatine had just had the executive power to declare war without approval of the Senate, but, you know, whatever. It needs to be that, like, democracy dies with thunderous applause. It's not nearly as interesting if democracy dies through exploiting the sci-fi equivalent of just vague Westminster convention. Finally, the Jedi fall right into Palpatine's plan. Like the stupid wizards they are. Once the Clone Wars break out, the Jedi Knights become generals in the Republic Army. That's pretty straightforward. You know, they're knights. There is an implication of violence right there in the name. This puts them right up and close with the clones, who then eventually betray them under Order 66. Overall, the Jedi Order and the Council are independent, but their allegiance is to the Senate. Therefore, Palpatine doesn't actually have direct influence or control over them. To kill two birds with one stone, or two Supreme Court justices if you will, Palpatine decides to appoint Anakin to the Jedi Council as his personal representative of the Republic. This naturally leads to division because Anakin is rejected the title of Master, leading to him being seduced by the dark side and becoming Darth Vader. The Jedi only really agree to this appointment so that they can have Anakin spy on Palpatine, which he like Uno Reverso cards instantly by going, "Hey, Anakin, are you a spy?" And Anakin just is a bad spy and goes, "Yes," because he can't keep a secret. But also, the Jedi Council is elected. Anakin straight up says that Palpatine doesn't have the power to appoint him to that council. That's the problem to begin with. Palpatine can't do that. So what does he do? He just does it anyway. The Jedi Council just is like, "Hey, you can't do that, but yeah, I guess here you go." So like, even though there is endless, expansive Star Wars like media that fills every nook and cranny of the time period of the fictional universe to explain even the blandest of minutiae, like things like where did Han Solo get his decorative dice charm, there isn't actually a contemporary or retroactive explanation or reasoning as to why George Lucas wrote it that the Jedi Council does not have an appointed representative for the Republic. Then Palpatine had to force one into existence anyway. That could have been a thing that you easily already wrote into the script to begin with. Like, let's say that there's an appointed position and then there's a Jedi Master in the Council that dies in the Clone Wars. And oh look, it's Palpatine's favourite thing, a vacancy that appears due to murder and violence. And then Palpatine can be the one who, like, nominates to fill the position. But there isn't even an implied vacancy. And then on top of this, before the Clone Wars are even resolved, the Jedi Council comes to the conclusion that if Palpatine does not relinquish his emergency powers once the war is finished, then he must be forcefully removed from office with violence. This is exactly the kind of move that Palpatine wants to happen, because that allows him to personally kill some Jedi and then become ugly for some reason after fighting Mace Windu with Force Lightning, and then use this excuse to then issue Order 66 and use it for an anti-Jedi propaganda campaign, which leads to their near extinction throughout the entire galaxy, so none of them can challenge him as he rises to the position of Emperor. So like, come on guys. Look, I've said it before and I'll say it again. You need to think through your military coups thoroughly, otherwise they're going to go wrong. Duh! After Order 66 and a bunch of Jedi die, the Empire is born. Chancellor Palpatine declares that the Galactic Senate will be remade into the Imperial Senate. He will now be known as the Emperor, and ta-da! It's now a monarchy! It's a monarchy! That's what a monarchy means, George! It's a system of government where the head of state rules until they abdicate or die by being thrown down a big pit. Ta-da! Wow, the monarchy of Naboo really went through some big changes, huh? So now Emperor Palpatine is the head of an absolute monarchy. That means that he has, you guessed it, unlimited power. We got there. In a constitutional monarchy, like, the monarch uses their executive power on the advice of, like, elected government, but in an absolute monarchy, they just make all the decisions. The Imperial Senate still exists, but that's just a formality to maintain power and direction over the planets that make up the Empire. And now just an extra little historical parallel. One royal power in a parliamentary system is the ability to dissolve and recall parliament. In the modern era, this is just a formality that happens to facilitate regular elections. But hundreds of years ago, back in England, this was very much according to the whim of the king. So King Charles I, for example, summoned a parliament from 1628 to 1629. It did not go the way that he wanted it to, and so he dissolved it and just did not call it back until 1640, 11 years later. So as we enter Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope, the Emperor uses his royal power to dissolve the Senate, only in this instance he just does not reconvene it. It is done now. Governors of the Empire now rule over the subjugated worlds with an autocratic government, and the iron fist of the Empire slowly crushes everything within its grasp, until one day the galaxy's most important Nepo baby, Luke Skywalker, stares longingly at the twin suns of Tatooine as they set, longing for adventure. And we're going to leave it there. I'm not going to get into the original trilogy, but just to reiterate, right? The process of how we got here, the rise of the Empire, starts with 1. A 14-year-old committing identity fraud in the Galactic Senate where, for some reason, there aren't any rules and you can just do anything you like. 2. Jar Jar Binks is an idiot who uses his tie-breaking vote to just give Palpatine emergency powers even though the war has not even started. And he consciously knows what he's doing is wrong. 3. Obi-Wan Kenobi just so happens to stumble upon a secret clone army whose purpose is never really thoroughly examined or questioned and is immediately put to use to start an intergalactic war. 4. The Constitution for the Galactic Senate is amended in peacetime to extend the term limits of Palpatine. And 5. No one used the multiple options to democratically and easily remove Palpatine from a position of power during the entire 13-year period of the prequels where he gradually increases his power. Literally at no point does anyone on Naboo or in the Galactic Senate really exercise the multiple options presented to them. Good work, George, you did it. Yay. Well, I'm convinced that the Sith are geniuses. They're just so smart. They're good. Palpatine's plot made so much sense. Democracy dies with whatever plot holes you are willing to overlook, really. Thank you for enduring this unnecessary rant that no one ever asked for, but I'm glad that you managed to get through this episode. Comment down below what you would like to learn about next. Subscribe if you'd like to, learn more about the Australian political system, not just fictional ones. And also a big thank you to my supporters on Patreon who give me a nice little beautiful snack called money. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Roll credits. Ba 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 ba.